Has the red wave been blocked? Battles for the U.S. legislature and state governorships were expected to cede to the right. Instead, Republicans are waking up disappointed. We'll explore some of the key races and what it all means for U.S. politics. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the U.S. midterm election. U.S. President Joe Biden called the 2022 midterm elections a battle for the soul of the nation. Others called it a referendum on his presidency, and even predicted a red wave would hand both houses of Congress to Republicans. But that's not quite how it's turning out. With only a few seats left in play in the Senate, it could still go either way. Both parties currently have 48 seats. Meanwhile, in the House of Representatives, Republicans are leading, but the magic number there is 218 to control the House. Now, with a more decisive win predicted, Republicans are not happy with the results. In Texas, Mayra Flores, the first Mexican-born congresswoman, has been unseated by her Democratic opponent, Vicente Gonzalez. She took to Twitter saying, "The red wave did not happen. Republicans and independents stayed home. Do not complain about the results if you did not do your part." Meanwhile, Pennsylvania flipped to a blue state after John Fetterman, the state lieutenant governor, backed Trump-backed TV celebrity Dr. Mehmet Oz. It was a high-voltage race and one of the most expensive campaigns of the year. Fetterman, known for his bald head, tattoos, and streetwear fashion, said his race was for every small town or person that ever felt left behind.
Every county, every vote. Every county, every vote. And that's exactly what happened. We jammed them up. We held the line. I never expected that we were going to turn these red counties blue, but we did what we needed to do, and we had that conversation across every one of those counties. And tonight, that's why I'll be the next U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania.
One of the top races to watch these midterms is the state of Arizona. Usually a red state. It's home to John McCain and five-term U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater. Arizona went to Biden in 2020. That was an election Republican gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake said was stolen from Donald Trump. Lake claimed she could only lose the governor's race if the election was stolen from her as well. And she told the press she'd witnessed faulty voting machines in Republican districts on Election Day.
We switched from a Republican area to vote. We came right down into the heart of liberal Phoenix to vote because we wanted to make sure that we had good machines. And guess what? They've had zero problems with their machines today. Not one machine spit out a ballot here today. Not one, in a very liberal area. So we were right to come and vote in a liberal area. They gotta fix this problem. This is incompetency. I hope it's not malice, but we're gonna fix it. We're gonna win. And when we win, there's gonna be come to Jesus for elections in Arizona. There's gonna be a come to Jesus.
Well, unfortunately for Kari Lake, it looks like Jesus might not come. So far, her state has bucked the red wave and in some races has gone blue. Joining me now from Phoenix, Arizona to tell us more about one of the most watched elections in the country is award-winning filmmaker and producer Nick Quested. Nick, thanks so much for being with us. You know, some of our viewers are going to recognize you because you were actually embedded with the Proud Boys during the January 6th insurrection. You were one of the first to testify before Congress about that day. And since then, you've continued working on the film you were making about division in America. So, as a follow-up to January 6th, you chose to come specifically to Arizona to cover the midterm elections. Why Arizona?
Well, there was, Kari Lake is obviously an interesting candidate because she's so closely tied to Donald Trump. In fact, many people call her Trump in stilettos over here. And we always felt that there was a good chance that if the election didn't go her way, she was not going to accept the results. So we felt that January 6th wasn't the end of anything, but it was potentially the beginning of, a consistent pattern of political violence and denial about election results.
Yeah, and the results so far have actually disappointed the high expectations of Arizona Republicans. You actually weren't really expecting that. Why?
The polling suggested that Ms. Lake was much further ahead, and the voters seem to have become very counter to the polling. And the turnout is huge. The turnout is much larger than people expected.
Yeah, we're hearing that. I want to get the final numbers on that, but that's actually encouraging to see voters really motivated now. But still, I mean, from what you saw on the ground there, and looking at what you're trying to explore in your film, do you see America still as divided as ever?
I think this shows you that America's actually more divided than it's ever been. I don't think America's faced this type of issue where there may have been political differences before, but unless you have a peaceful transition of power, the fundamental tenets of American liberal democracy don't work. You have to have a free and fair election, and you have to accept the results. And if you want to challenge that, then you can challenge that through the legislative process, not by disputing the results.
Right. We'll still have to see how she responds. I mean, in the meantime, as a filmmaker, you tend to look for the most interesting stories on the ground, the most interesting visuals as well. So describe, some of the moments in the Arizona campaign, the lead up to this vote, where you thought, wow, this is pretty out there.
Well, it was interesting. We were at a Kari Lake rally, and she turned round to us and said, this is the fake news that is trying to steal your election. And she basically vilified the press. There was another moment where she said, I'm going to be your worst nightmare for 8 years because I'm going to serve and I'm going to turn you back into real journalists. I think the hubris is pretty clear right now.
Yeah, the news
especially
that she used to work for.
A neophyte candidate that used to be a television presenter for her whole career.
Exactly.
For her to on her own, on journalists in such an explicit way without any real policy, just vitriol was quite distressing.
Yeah. Aside from Kari Lake, though, you were also looking at some of the other, I want to call them fringe groups. I don't know if they're still on the fringes as much, but you looked at, for example, the Lions of Liberty and how they were monitoring, taking it upon themselves to kind of watch the vote. Are groups like that kind of more prevalent, more emboldened than before?
I absolutely think we spent some time with the Lions of Liberty, and the Lions of Liberty were poll watchers. I mean, they stayed within the law, but as it's written, they didn't do anything illegal. But there is a level in certain counties of, the idea is to get the most people to vote, not to reduce the vote. So there's a potential that people would be concerned that someone was watching the mail-in drop box. So I think that the fringe groups are becoming more and more emboldened.
Right. I know you've stayed up extremely late. You've been following this election and will continue to follow until we get the results. But I mean, any idea what groups like the Lions of Liberty and Kari Lake, might do now, given that it looks like they are not coming out ahead in what will be the final result?
There's no more voting per se. So I think the Lions of Liberty are sort of out the frame right now. But I think it's odds on that if Ms. Lake loses, then she will dispute the election. She's already in her very unusual speech that she made during her party, where she started to blame the election machines for not counting votes. So she's setting herself up for to contest the election.
Right. Nick Quested, we'll maybe be checking in with you then in the coming days and weeks once we see how this really does unfold. But thanks so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. We really appreciate it. Let's broaden out the discussion now and bring in 3 new panelists. Joining me from Columbus, Ohio, is Mitch Lerner. He's a registered Democrat and professor of political history at Ohio State University. From Washington, we have Republican strategist Adam Raezler. And from London, Iwan Morgan is an emeritus professor of U.S. history at University College London. Thanks all so much for being with us. Mitchell, I'll start with you, but I want to get everyone's take on this, and I want to know what your actual expectations were and how you're feeling about the results, so far. Is this good for the United States?
Hi, Andrea. I'm excited about the results, pleasantly surprised. It certainly exceeds, I think, the expectations of almost all the Democrats out there. I'm optimistic about what it says for the future of the country. For your audience who may not follow American politics all that closely, let me note really quickly to give you some sort of historical context here of relevance. This is an off-cycle election, meaning the presidency is not on the line. And so we're voting for senators and congressmen and governors and local officials. And that means turnout's usually a little bit less. But more importantly, it means that the party that's in power in the White House usually gets killed. So just as an example, Barack Obama's first off-year election cycle, he lost 63 House seats. Bill Clinton lost 53. Donald Trump lost 41. Looks like Biden's going to lose, and there's still a lot out there, but he's probably going to lose 8, 10, 12 seats.
Right.
Usually the incumbent party gets killed in the Senate, probably going to break even here. So this really exceeds expectations.
Okay, that's good. Adam, if it exceeds expectations for Democrats, what do you think as a Republican?
Yeah, the red wave did not hit. It was more of a red ripple. We do still have a lot in the balance. There are several races on the Senate side that have not been called, and the balance of power for the House of Representatives still has not yet been declared after yesterday's voting. But I think something that is important to notice where there were wins for Republicans, while it was not as big as they had expected, Democrats extinguished 2 Democratic superstars. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, running for governor for the second time, and Beto O'Rourke has now lost 3 elections in a row. These are 2 Democrats that the party had believed were rising superstars. They had invested hundreds of millions of dollars behind these 2, and they have one thing in common, and that is all they do is waste money and lose elections. The other big bright spot for Republicans was Ron DeSantis's win in Florida. Ron DeSantis has decisively taken Florida off the map for Democrats. If they have any hope that they could even be competitive there in the 2024 election, then there really did not take any lessons away from this election. So one of the largest electoral prizes in populated states is really now for quite some time, at least the next few cycles, going to be painted completely red. But for Republicans, it was not as great of a night as we were expecting. Donald Trump did not get the crowning night that he was expecting in this midterm election. He had some candidates that really did emerge, right, that he had endorsed in the U.S. Senate races and in Missouri, in North Carolina, and Ohio.
Yeah.
But shy of that, he did not pull as many across as he was expected to.
Ewan, let me ask you about that. What do you think this result actually says about Donald Trump?
I think what Americans did was they voted.
Just to Ewan quickly.
Well, it wasn't a good night for Trump, although he will talk it up as a great night for him. But fundamentally, results, for example, the Republicans who won in Georgia weren't exactly Trump Republicans. Not sure what's going to happen in Arizona, but it looks as if the Democrats are going to hold that. So fundamentally, and of course, Pennsylvania was a bad set of results for Trump. So he will make much of the result in Ohio, where J.D. Vance won. But I don't think it's boosted his prospects. He will probably announce, but he's already trying to keep DeSantis from also putting his hat in the ring, which is quite significant.
Yeah, where do you think this leaves his 2024 prospects quickly?
It leaves his 2024 prospects hanging very much in the balance. It's a question where Republicans go. I think a lot of them will blame Trump for the less than spectacular showing, but very few will say so publicly. So it's still a Trumpified Republican Party. And of course, this begs the question of which Democrat has the best chance of defeating Donald Trump, should he be the candidate in 2024. And all the polls point to the fact that the best Democrat capable of beating Trump is the current incumbent. And the Democrats don't have much else in their locker in terms of potential candidates.
Mitchell, let me come back to you, because even though the Republicans did not sweep this midterm election, they are still very much there in the legislature. And what does that mean for Joe Biden going forward? How much will or won't he be able to do?
Well, generally speaking, I think we are in for further paralysis, to be quite frank. The Republicans are likely to take the House. Senate is going to be very evenly divided. Neither side is going to have enough of a majority to overcome a filibuster or to overcome a veto. So by and large, I think there's not going to be a lot that gets done. There are a couple areas in particular that do worry me as a Democrat, but really as sort of a citizen of the world. And I'll quickly point to two that I think the House Republicans could really mess up. One is efforts at climate change. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act had about $600 billion in credits and other programs for climate change programs. But without cooperation with the House and various state legislatures, those might be in danger. The bigger issue for me, and there's actually a couple of them, but the bigger issue is if the House refuses to raise the debt ceiling. And that could lead to a potential economic catastrophe, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Republicans, there are some extremists who have talked about that a lot over the years, but I think it's usually just been as part of a negotiating process. I think there are some who really believe it right now, and that could really shake the faith of the world economy in the U.S. system.
Okay. Adam, I got to ask you, because it is interesting that it almost seems like, the word, I want to unify the United States, I want to unify the Congress, that used to be heard in so many campaigns that no matter which party you were with, you could be the unifier. That seems like a liability now. People don't really say that anymore. So what do you think the Republicans will try to do, and how much people are talking about how much they might try to hone in on kind of personal attacks, going after Hunter Biden, for example? Do you think that's how they're going to play this out?
A lot, going back to the term unifier, it depends on how you define that, right? Joe Biden still claims to be that unifier, but he's now given 3 or 4 speeches talking about the threat to democracy from what he calls ultra MAGA Republicans. And you're not unifying anybody by doing that. You're continuing to drive that divisive tone throughout the national politic. And Republicans in the House are going to have that very narrow margin. It is still predicted that they are going to take the majority, but by a much more narrow margin. It will likely be something similar to what Democrats hold today. Anywhere it has been a balance between like 5 and 10 vote majority. And they're going to have to find that balance of how much time do we spend investigating and going after, whether it be Hunter Biden or going after the Afghanistan withdrawal, and how much time do we spend trying to deliver on the promises that we made, whether that be on inflation, on energy, on Parents' Bill of Rights, all of those different fronts. And so it'll be very interesting to see how they balance that. The last point I want to quickly make is on the debt ceiling vote. Republicans are always the ones that are chastised, saying, oh, they're going to run the country into the ground and ruin the world economically because they won't raise the debt ceiling. What they're going to do is they're going to use that as a negotiating tactic with Biden and say it's time to reduce government spending. For a perfect example, something that they're going to take to the table as a non-negotiable is Biden's new 87,000 IRS agents. Republicans are not going to give the IRS that budget to fund that.
Okay.
And so there's going to be pieces where Biden is going to have to make some concessions, but Republicans as well, because they are not going to control all of Washington. And so everyone's going to have to come to the table and be willing to let some go and make some compromise.
Adam, I have to ask you this, specifically as a Republican, are you proud to see certain candidates in certain states who, not just advocate for Trump, but for theories of a stolen election and some other kind of, bizarre conspiracy-like takes on what's happening in politics? Is it okay with you? I'm thinking specifically even of Herschel Walker.
I think, for Republicans, the party has evolved in so much over the last, really since 2016. We've brought in, and we saw last night how well Republicans did with Latino voters in South Florida, especially in the Miami-Dade area. that the party is really now made up of a wide array of mixed opinions and perspectives. And this is now where the party is going to have to go forward in if they take control of the House. And there is still the potential possibility they could flip the Senate, but they're going to have to really look at what does the plurality of American voters who are registered Republicans, but who also are independents and moderates, what is their desire and direction? And I do think that a majority of the electorate is ready to stop litigating and discussing the 2020 election, regardless of everyone's personal thoughts. That is now 2 years behind us. It is time to really start moving forward and looking at how do we continue to advance and build on the success the party has had, but also learn from some areas where we didn't win.
I think the reason I ask about Herschel Walker is because many argue he's been caught lying on fundamental issues like abortion. He claims to be pro-life, but we know that some evidence has been presented claiming he paid for several abortions. His own son has kind of, made the same allegations. And it's almost reminiscent of Trump saying he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and it wouldn't make any difference. I mean, is that where we're at?
That's a tough one to answer, but it does look like that, and that's the challenging part. What today's or yesterday's election showed is voters voted on the quality of the candidate, not as much on where do I feel about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but who is best fit to represent me, my community, in our district or our state in Washington. And that's why we saw so many split tickets in different states, and that's why we're seeing such competitive races still uncalled. Because voters are really evaluating the candidate themselves now.
Iwan, let me ask you, we also can't forget going forward that the Supreme Court is still ruled and will be for some time by conservative judges. So whatever even happens in the legislature, how much do those justices really determine what path the country takes? I'm even thinking of an election issue at play in Arizona, which we just looked at, being prayer in school, for example.
Yes, that is something that is very significant about the American system. Just one thing, everybody assumed that the economy, and in particular inflation, would sweep away the Democrats. But it's quite significant that the abortion issue has raised its head again. It appeared to be a major issue in midsummer and then seemed to fall away. But quite clearly, it has come back. It is one of the two main issues that shaped voting in this election. So it was a vote loser by and large for the Democrats, and we have seen. Also, 3 states really have pro-choice referenda. We're still waiting on Kentucky. Kentucky's referendum will be very significant in this regard.
Okay.
So I think that the Supreme Court, and of course the Supreme Court is now considering, got a case before it on affirmative action. And what it says on affirmative action, which will come out, the judgment will come out early next year, that could again have an effect on the, well, I wouldn't say the switch of some African-American votes, but certainly the loss of some African votes to the Republican Party.
Okay. Mitchell, let me come back to you. We can kind of wrap with this because there has been just more and more mention of religion in politics. We heard from Kari Lake and how much she invoked it in her campaign. For a country that was actually founded on the separation of church and state, in 2022, to be hearing about the role, how much it played, I mean, is just the line being completely blurred now and politicians can really feel free to go in an entirely different direction?
Well, to some extent, that's absolutely true. And there's really been a rebirth over the past decade or two, I think, of religious fervor in the United States. But I think it's a delicate line, particularly for Republicans to walk. And we see a lot more of this in the primaries than we do in the actual general elections. You turn out your base, right, in the primaries. And for the Republicans, that often means going back to these issues that Professor Morgan talked about, whether it's prayer in schools or whether it's abortion, that really animate the Republican right. But then in the general election, those don't always play so well. So I think we saw that with abortion in the last election, and we'll see what impact it has in 2024.
And what do you make of the role the Supreme Court is going to play going forward?
I think that the Supreme Court is a more political body than most people in the United States have given it credit for. And only now, over the last few years, particularly after the Republicans stole the seat that should have gone to Merrick Garland, has the general population started to really cast doubt on the independence of the Supreme Court. So certainly they're going to play a role in the electoral process, but more and more Americans are losing faith in it, as in the same way that they're losing faith in the government all around it. So I think the Supreme Court is just one part of a larger conversation about the trust that the American people have in their government that has to go forward.
Mitch Lerner, Adam Raezler, and Iwan Morgan, I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I would like to thank our viewers for joining us as well. And do remember, you can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers. And do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.